Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
She said it like she was asking me to pass the salt, flat, indifferent, and bored out of her skull. "You're a legacy problem, Mark," she said, clicking her pen twice before placing it delicately on the mahogany desk between us. I'd seen that desk come in last quarter, imported Italian wood with some executive-grade finish that cost more than my first car. That pen probably cost more than my last vacation. She leaned back like she was doing me a favor, like calling someone a legacy problem was just a clinical diagnosis and not a bullet between the eyes. I didn't say anything right away. Hell, I couldn't. My brain short-circuited for a second trying to reconcile that this 28-year-old LinkedIn poster child, who probably still got her coffee order wrong half the time, had just written off almost 2 decades of my life like I was an outdated app on her iPhone. We were in conference room D, the cold one near the IT wing, the one with the flickering light they never bothered fixing. I'd sat in that room during company crises, growth announcements, hiring pushes, and layoff bloodbaths. I'd never expected to be the star of this particular horror show. Jessica Rollins didn't flinch. She looked at me like a dentist waiting for the Novocaine to kick in. "We're modernizing. You've been a steady hand, but we need to be more agile, faster moving. You represent the old model. We appreciate your service." Service. Like I was being discharged from the army with a handshake and a folded flag. No prior warnings. No performance review. No plan. Just a manila envelope and a thin-lipped smile. I looked down at the severance paperwork, already filled out. Dated last week. My name spelled right. No typos. That was almost the most insulting part. They took their time getting it just right. "You've built a lot here," she added, like she was talking about sandcastles on a beach before the tide came in. But things change. Then came the fake sympathy, the performative regret. "We wish you the best in your future endeavors." I'd used that line myself over the years, but when you're on the receiving end, it feels like someone spitting in your drink and handing it back with a smile. Still, I didn't speak. I didn't argue or grovel or even blink too hard. I just stared at her, not at her words, but through them, past the sleek bob haircut and the expensive blazer and the Botox-smooth forehead, and I saw it clear as day. She didn't have the slightest idea what she'd just done. I took the envelope, stood up slowly, and reached across the desk to shake her hand. She hesitated for a half second. Maybe she thought I'd try something dramatic, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. I smiled the way you smile when someone cuts you off in traffic and you know exactly where they're headed. It wasn't over. Not by a damn sight. Outside the glass walls, I saw faces duck and heads turn, like I was a patient being wheeled out of surgery. No one wanted to make eye contact. HR was waiting near the elevator with that sheepish, just doing my job look. A security guy I didn't recognize followed me like I might stuff a stapler down my pants or hack into a server on my way out. I had no box of things. Everything I had was in the cloud or already deleted. It was clean, surgical. As the elevator doors slid shut, I felt it hit. Not just the humiliation that came later, over a drink, but the sheer absurdity. I wasn't dead weight. I wasn't outdated. I was the guy who kept the gears from flying off when this place was one bad quarter away from bankruptcy. I was the one who took calls at 2 in the morning when systems went down. I knew every flaw in our infrastructure because I'd patched half of them myself. I trained 3 of the execs currently sitting in the boardroom. But to Jessica Rollins and her startup sharks in tailored suits, I was nothing more than a line item that made their pitch deck look bloated. Now here's a question for you, and be honest with yourself. What would you do if your boss blindsided you like this? Just tore you out of your job like wallpaper in a house they didn't even build? Would you walk away with your head high? Or would you plot something? Something quiet. Something clever. Something they wouldn't see coming until it was too late? By the time I stepped outside, the air felt different. It wasn't colder, but it sure as hell felt heavier. I sat in my car for 15 minutes, engine off, just staring at the steering wheel like it might blink first. I thought about calling my wife. Then didn't. I thought about calling my lawyer. Then didn't. What I did instead was open the glove box and pull out the old flash drive I kept stashed behind the insurance papers. It wasn't labeled. Just plain black plastic. But I knew what was on it. Jessica didn't know this company like I did. She didn't know that for every legacy problem she was trying to erase, there was a trail, and some trails lead straight into things you don't want investors sniffing around. She thought she was modernizing. What she was really doing was stepping into a machine she didn't understand and yanking out parts labeled danger, do not remove. The beauty of it was, I didn't even need to lift a finger. Not yet. All I had to do was wait. They'd come to me. They always did. Because no one ever asks how the sausage gets made until the machine breaks down and starts spraying blood. That night, I poured a whiskey, sat on my porch, and watched the sun go down like it was a curtain closing on an act I hadn't agreed to leave. And then I smiled again, the same slow grin I gave Jessica Rollins in that cold-ass boardroom. She called me a legacy problem. Damn right I was. And legacies? They have a funny way of coming back. When I first walked into the building back in 2010, the place looked like it had just survived a hurricane made of bad decisions and worse management. Cords everywhere, whiteboards filled with scribbles that meant nothing. People in mismatched chairs talking over each other with the kind of panic you only see in sinking ships. The company was called Lexbridge Systems back then, before the rebrand, before the logo redesigns and mission statements started flowing like cheap wine at a failed startup mixer. We were a small tech services firm bleeding clients after a bad merger, and someone upstairs had the crazy idea to bring in real operations help from the outside. That was me, just a guy with 2 kids, a mortgage, and a knack for figuring out how broken systems fit back together. I didn't come in swinging a hammer or with some flashy title. I came in as director of operations, but really I was a glorified janitor in a suit. My job was to clean the mess quietly, make things hum, make it look like someone was steering the damn ship, even when the compass was spinning. I built new reporting models, stitched together vendor relationships from scratch, and kept the dev teams from eating each other alive during product sprints. I worked weekends, pulled all-nighters during our first real infrastructure overhaul, and once spent my anniversary in a hotel room in Chicago on a conference call trying to stop a server collapse that nearly cost us our largest client. The thing about doing your job well, especially the boring, unsexy parts, is that people stop noticing. When the system works, when the fires get smaller, when things don't fall apart, no one gives you a parade. They just stop complaining, and eventually, they assume the chaos wasn't that bad to begin with. That's what happened to me. I didn't ask for medals or corner offices, but I did expect a little honesty when things started shifting. Over the years, I watched the company grow teeth. New investors came in, new clients, a few acquisitions. We survived the recession, barely, and made it out the other side a little leaner, a little smarter. I was part of every major internal project, sat in on strategic planning calls, helped shape the culture from the inside out. And then came the rebrand, when Lexbridge became Thorntech, with a new font, a new vision, and a new obsession with disruption and agile frameworks. That was also when Jessica Rollins first appeared. She was a consultant back then, working with one of the private equity groups that had taken a stake in us. She didn't know a damn thing about our back-end architecture or client retention issues, but she had slide decks that looked like TED Talks and a way of speaking that made even simple ideas sound revolutionary. Words like velocity, synergy, and modernization came out of her mouth so smoothly, you almost forgot she hadn't answered a real question yet. I didn't trust her the minute I met her, but I did what I always did. I played it straight, offered help, answered questions, and assumed the good work would speak for itself. It didn't. Over the next couple of years, she went from external consultant to VP of strategy, which meant she got to sit in rooms and make calls on things she didn't fully understand. Usually by repeating something someone else had said louder and with more hand gestures. She started surrounding herself with a younger, flashier team. People who dressed like they were going to brunch with venture capitalists and talked like they were auditioning for Shark Tank. And somewhere along the way, I realized she wasn't just part of the team, she was quietly taking it over. I remember the first time she asked me to walk her through our legacy operations stack, said it in that casual way that made it sound like she wanted to learn. So I did. I gave her everything: charts, workflows, historic context, bottlenecks, even where we had gaps. I trained her replacement and didn't even know it. Because 6 months later, she pitched the board on flattening the hierarchy and refreshing leadership roles. I didn't even see the knife until it was halfway in. And maybe that's on me. Maybe I should have played the game harder, posted more on LinkedIn, worn tighter suits, called everything a solution. But I thought the work would be enough. That if you carried the weight long enough, someone would notice. Turns out, what they really notice is how long you've been carrying it, and how good it would look to put down the old guard before an IPO to show the world that the company was fresh, lean, and innovative. What stings the most isn't that she fired me. It's that I handed her the blueprint for how to do it, brick by brick. I showed her where all the weak spots were, all the things I held together with tape and memory, and she smiled and nodded and took notes. Then she pitched that weakness as opportunity and used it to sell change. She made me obsolete, not because I was, but because it made her look like a visionary. There's no gold watch in this business. No farewell speech. Just a clean break and a tighter budget. And the worst part is, I didn't even fight it. I walked out with my chin up, but every step away from that building felt like erasing my own name from the company history one letter at a time. Now, sitting here, staring at my old project files, I see it all clearer than ever. The plan wasn't just to modernize. It was to wipe the slate clean before the public offering. No baggage, no hard questions, no memory of how things used to work. Just bright faces and bigger promises. But here's the thing Jessica didn't count on. Sometimes the old systems are the only ones that actually work. And sometimes, the guy holding them together remembers everything. There's something strange about the first Monday morning after getting fired. Your body still wakes up at the same damn time, like some sadistic alarm clock buried in your spine, and you stare at the ceiling wondering what meetings you're missing until you remember you don't have any left. The silence hits different when no one's expecting you, when your phone doesn't buzz with pointless Slack messages or those reply-all email chains where 10 people weigh in to say absolutely nothing. I made coffee slower than usual just to fill the time and stared out the window like I was trying to remember what the hell people did when they weren't knee-deep in operations logs and budget spreadsheets. The plan, and I use that word loosely, was to give myself space, maybe even breathe for the first time in years, see if I could feel normal again. I had folders to organize, a garage full of neglected tools, and some dusty ambition to finally take the fishing trip I'd been promising myself since 2017. But 2 days in, I found myself hovering over my inbox, refreshing it like some junkie waiting for a hit of relevance. That's when her name popped up, Rachel Meeks. Former HR manager, one of the few people in that building who knew how to listen without calculating. The subject line was just, "You didn't get this from me." The attachment was a PowerPoint deck, clean, corporate, polished within an inch of its life, stamped with the Thorntech logo and titled Q3 Recovery Strategy, System Architecture Gaps. I didn't need to read more than 2 slides to feel my stomach clench. They were still using my framework, or more accurately, they were using the wreckage of it. But instead of acknowledging that they'd gutted the thing, rewired it with half-baked ideas, and broke the spine of a system that had held together longer than it should have, they blamed the original build. Slide after slide, my name wasn't mentioned, but the implication screamed from every bullet point. Inflexible legacy process design. Operational rigidity pre-modernization. Inherited architecture shortcomings. Translation. Everything that's breaking now? That's on the guy we just kicked out. No mention of how we kept uptime above 99% during a 5-year client expansion. No mention of how the system was never meant to handle the Frankenstein integrations they shoved into it post-acquisition. They didn't modernize. They duct-taped features onto a core they didn't understand, and now they were shocked it was buckling. And the kicker? In the appendix, they'd included a future state architecture diagram, something flashy for the investors, no doubt, and I damn near laughed when I saw it. It was my old Phase 2 draft, the one I floated 2 years ago, and was told was too conservative. They hadn't innovated a damn thing. They took my work, stripped it of context, renamed the pieces, and called it the next big leap. And now, as it starts to fail, they're pushing the narrative that it was already broken when they found it. I closed the file, poured myself another cup of coffee, and stood in the doorway of my home office for a long while. The shelves were still stacked with binders I should have thrown out years ago. Old drafts, architecture maps, procurement notes, redline memos from every department I'd supported. Somewhere in there was the full picture, not just of how the system worked, but how it almost broke. And I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years, the old encrypted drive. I built it during the stormiest period in our company's history, right around the time of the Midvale acquisition, when we swallowed a company twice as disorganized and half as honest as we'd hoped. There were red flags all over that deal, and I'd started archiving communications, audit trails, data logs, and chain of custody reports just in case. Not because I thought I'd need them someday, but because back then, I was still naive enough to think someone upstairs might care if we exposed the mess. It had been sitting in my file cabinet, unlabeled, nestled between tax folders and old USB drives with forgotten family photos. I dusted it off and plugged it in. After a few minutes of awkward password attempts, it unlocked with a quiet click, and there it was. Every backup file, every message, every spreadsheet I'd saved to protect the company from itself. Except now, the company wasn't mine. And that information? It wasn't a precaution anymore. It was leverage. I didn't move fast. This wasn't about rage or payback or sticking it to anyone just to feel better. This was chess. They were out there rewriting history, feeding investors half-truths, and selling change while standing on a foundation I poured with my own damn hands. And now that cracks were forming, they were looking for a scapegoat to throw under the bus at just the right angle. Thing is, I'm not under the bus. I built the bus. I know every bolt, every shortcut, every corner they cut. And if someone starts digging, if someone really starts asking questions about why our biggest client dropped 2 accounts last month, or why our procurement chain is suddenly delayed, or why the new system can't handle half the load it used to, those answers won't come from a PowerPoint deck. They'll come from people like Rachel, who saw what was happening and said nothing until it was too late. They'll come from engineers they ignored, clients they overpromised, and, if I'm patient, from me, the legacy problem they pushed out too fast and too cleanly. So I did what any good janitor would do when someone makes a mess pretending to be clever. I started reviewing my cleanup notes. And I waited. It started with a single forwarded email, old, dusty, and overlooked, the kind you forget you even saved until it comes back like a ghost, reminding you that you never really left the graveyard. I found it while sifting through the encrypted drive, buried inside a folder labeled with a nonsense string of letters I must have typed during one of those late nights when sleep felt like a luxury. The email was from someone in finance, dated just after the Midvale acquisition, and it casually mentioned cleaning up the books before the next board report, not unusual language at a glance, but paired with the attachments and timestamp. It was the first brick in a long, ugly wall. I kept reading. One file turned into 20, then into spreadsheets, then into message threads with red flags so big they could have been seen from the moon. The Midvale deal had always smelled off, even back then, but no one wanted to ask questions because it was Jessica's big win, her first golden feather before she slid into the executive chair like she was born for it. We were promised integration, efficiency, and new revenue streams. What we got was a tangle of incompatible systems, overlapping client accounts, and vague numbers that never quite reconciled. And I, stupidly, had been the guy tasked with harmonizing all of it, a word they used like it was some kind of corporate spa treatment instead of a euphemism for make this mess disappear. Now I knew why none of it added up. They hadn't just failed to integrate Midvale, they'd cooked half the data to make it look like it worked. I had logs showing timestamp manipulations, emails where lower-level staff flagged issues and were ignored, and worst of all, a memo from the controller suggesting that we defer loss recognition until the next fiscal year. With Jessica's name CC'd in her one-line reply, good thinking, let's revisit Q2. That one line sat in my stomach like a stone. I didn't rage. I didn't fantasize about going to the press or storming back into the building like some corporate Rambo. What I did was simple, quiet, and deliberate. I called a friend from college, we'll call him David, who worked for a legal firm that specialized in compliance and whistleblower support. I didn't use my name. I told him I had a client. I told him the situation in vague terms. He said, it happens more than you think, and then walked me through how to file a preliminary whistleblower complaint, anonymously, but traceable. Just enough to light a match. I didn't file it under my own name. I used someone else's, someone whose name would make the dots harder to connect. No risk to them, no trail to me, not at first. The complaint went in on a Thursday. By Monday morning, I was already hearing things. An ex-coworker from procurement messaged me on LinkedIn, short, awkward, almost paranoid. Hey, weird question, but have you heard anything about a new audit? Another from engineering asked if I'd seen the drop in stock value after the earnings call adjustments. Then came Rachel again, who wrote just 4 words. What did you do? I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because by then, the wheels were already turning. Internal audit was launched. Not the usual performative kind either, not some box-checking fluff from HR, but a real outside firm with its own name, its own suits, and its own reputation to protect. That's when the mood in the building shifted. Jessica canceled 2 town halls in the same week. Word was she had family obligations, but I knew that script too well. She wasn't ducking employees. She was ducking accountability. And just when I thought it might quiet down, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost let it ring out, but something in my gut told me to answer. It was Daniel Wu, an old software lead who used to drink black coffee and complain about everything, the guy who once called my system design antiquated but dependable, like it was a compliment laced with an insult. His voice was different now, less cocky, more measured. I just wanted to say, he paused, and I could tell he hated needing to say it. We didn't know about all that crap after Midvale. We thought you were just slow to adapt. I didn't know they were hanging you out to dry. I let him sit in that silence for a few seconds before I said, yeah, well, now you do. He exhaled, almost relieved. If it helps, they're scrambling. No one knows who dropped the hammer. Jessica's. Well, she's not talking much. You didn't hear it from me. Of course not. It was strange how quiet revenge actually was. There were no explosions, no dramatic confrontations, no slamming of doors or righteous speeches. Just a slow, creeping panic that started at the top and trickled down like a leaky pipe above the server room. I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. But I felt something shift, a weight redistribute. They'd spent months trying to erase the past. Now it was crawling out from the floorboards. I spent that night sitting on the back porch, drink in hand, the drive still plugged into my laptop inside. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to, because the truth was already loose. And truth, when it leaks, has a way of soaking through everything, especially those glossy surfaces built to look untouchable. The whistle had been blown. Now I just had to wait for the stampede. It didn't come with a press release, not at first, just a short internal email sent late Friday evening, the kind meant to miss the news cycle, with language carefully crafted by lawyers and scrubbed by PR. Jessica Rollins was stepping down to pursue new opportunities, which was corporate code for the walls are closing in and no one's throwing you a rope. The email thanked her for visionary leadership and transformative efforts, and I nearly choked on my coffee when I read it. Because if transformative means torching what works and blaming everyone else when it burns, then sure, she was a damn visionary. By Monday, the rumors had started, whispers from inside, texts from former colleagues I hadn't heard from in months, all circling around the same theme. Investors had started asking too many questions. The audit had turned over just enough dirt to stain her, not enough to bury her completely, but enough to push her out before earnings season. Her exit wasn't explosive, it wasn't televised, it was surgical, just like they'd wanted mine to be. But the difference was, I left quietly because I chose to. She left because she didn't have a choice anymore. The irony didn't escape me. The woman who called me a legacy problem had become a liability of her own. Too much heat, too many paper trails, too many people suddenly remembering that they had doubts all along. And as she faded out of view, like a ghost swallowed by fog, I got the call. It came from a number I didn't recognize, early on a Wednesday morning while I was still half-dressed, waiting for the toast to pop. The voice on the other end was clipped but polite, calm in that overly careful way that meant it came from someone who never said anything without weighing the stock impact. His name was Charles Ingram, board liaison, and he said he'd like to discuss an opportunity. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just told him to send the details and I'd look it over. The email arrived within the hour. They wanted to bring me back, not as COO, not as some symbolic return of the prodigal operations guy, but as a senior strategic advisor. High pay, flexible terms, minimal press. Just enough visibility to reassure the investors that someone with institutional knowledge was back on the radar, but not enough to make it look like they'd made a mistake by letting me go in the first place. The offer was generous. And clean. Too clean, maybe. I sat at my kitchen table with the contract open on the screen, staring at the figures. It was more money than I'd made in the last 5 years combined, with no bonus traps, no long-term clawbacks. It was a golden leash, except this time they weren't locking it around my neck. They were placing it gently on the table and waiting for me to pick it up. I stood up, walked to the window, coffee in hand, and watched the morning bleed into the sky like it had somewhere else to be. The street was quiet. The same old tree still leaned too far over the driveway. My kids were older now, nearly grown. I'd missed soccer games, piano recitals, birthdays where I showed up late with guilt in one hand and a slice of cake in the other. I had built so much for a company that didn't flinch when it cut me loose. Now they were coming back, not with apologies, but with a business transaction wrapped in a second chance. And I wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to walk away for good. To say no, not out of pride or spite, but because I finally understood that I didn't owe them a damn thing. They hadn't earned me back. They hadn't even said sorry. But the part of me that spent 12 years stitching that place together was still there, whispering that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild it the right way this time, not for them, but for the people still inside who didn't deserve to drown. I thought about the files I hadn't shared yet, the ones still sitting on that encrypted drive, waiting like unspent ammunition. I thought about what I could do with them, not out of revenge, but out of truth. Because sometimes burning a place down is the only way to clear enough ground to build something worth standing on. The cursor blinked on the email draft I hadn't finished. I could accept the offer, take the money, play the game from a position of quiet strength. Or I could stay right where I was, outside the walls, but finally free, with no more illusions about loyalty or legacy. I smiled, not because I had the answer, but because I finally knew the question was mine to answer, not theirs. Not anymore. And that, maybe, was the real win.